Good evening. Thank you for everyone joining us online and here at the ASU California Center Broadway at the historic Herald Examiner building in downtown Los Angeles. With great respect, Zócalo Public Square acknowledges the Yuhaviatum, the first people of this ancestral and unceded territory of Yagna that we now know as downtown Los Angeles. We honor their elders, past and present, and the Yuhaviatum descendants who are part of the Gabrielino Tongva and the Fernandino Tataviam nations. We recognize that the Tongva are still here, and we are committed to lifting up their stories, culture, and community. As Kuyam, we recognize our responsibility and obligation to care for their land. I'm Ariana Rivera-Lee, and I'm the Senior Programs Coordinator at Zócalo Public Square, a unit of Arizona State University Media Enterprise. At Zócalo, our mission is to connect people to ideas and to each other. Everything we do is free, and everyone is welcome. We publish original writing and present conversations like this one. You can find us at zocalopublicsquare.org, on podcast platforms, and YouTube. So please subscribe for our latest programs. We were founded in 2003 and are now celebrating our 21st birthday year. Our program tonight asks, will the real young voters please stand up? We're pleased to co-present this program with LAist 89.3, the Los Angeles Local News Initiative, Boyle Heights Beat, and Cal Matters, with generous support from the Eli and Edith Broad Foundation. I'll now turn it over to John Cohn from LAist.
Thank you. Thank you, Ariana. Good evening. How's everybody doing tonight? All right, one more time. I realize it's midweek. How's everybody doing tonight? Excellent. Well, on behalf of LAist, welcome to tonight's program. I'm John Cohn. I oversee live programming and events for LAist. By a round of applause, just to keep the audience participation portion going, by a round of applause, how many of you listen to or read content on LAist? And have any out there? Great. Thank you so much for doing so. For those that don't, we're an NPR affiliate public radio station and local newsroom. You can find us on the dial at 89.3 FM and online at laist.com. While you're there, be sure to check out our voter game plan, your trusted, nonpartisan friend during this race to election day. We present the facts. You decide who or what gets your vote. We won't be a part of that process. Also, while you're there, be sure to sign up for one or more of our newsletters. This is the best way to get the latest and greatest that is churned out of our LAist newsroom delivered directly to you. So thank you so very much. We are thrilled tonight to be co-presenting this program with Zócalo Public Square and this cohort of incredible partners. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to the moderator for this evening, Christian Paz. He is a senior politics reporter at Vox, where he covers the Democratic Party and the 2024 elections. He joined Vox in 2022 after reporting on national and international politics for the Atlantic's Politics, Global, and Ideas teams, including the role of Latino voters in the 2020 election. Our moderator for the evening, Christian Paz.
My back. Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Christian Paz. I'm a senior politics reporter for Vox.com. Before we get into our conversation, we'd like to start with two public service announcements made by Cal State LA students Alexander Gray and Thomas Lau, selected by the Pat Brown Institute for Public Affairs for its PSA Get Out the Vote Film Challenge, generously sponsored by the Eli and Edith Broad Foundation.
We can remember a time in which we couldn't wait to have a say in this decision. Well, your time is now.
This year,
nearly 8 million young Americans will have the opportunity to cast their ballots for the first time. This isn't about who's wrong or who's right. This is about your right. Now, it's finally your time. Your voice matters. And this November, make sure you never forget your first. Vote. Make sure your first time is a memorable one. Find out more at vote.gov.
Hi, welcome to Democracy Delectables. How can I help you today? Yeah, are you guys still doing that vote for what you want deal? Yes, we are. Vote and you get 1 free cake. Awesome, okay. I'll take that. Okay. Here you go. Oh. No, wait, I'm sorry. This isn't what I wanted. I'm sorry, but in order to get the cake, you have to vote. Without your vote, you don't get a say in what cake you get. Oh. Sorry, 1 second. Order up! Oh, so they all voted and they got what they wanted? Yep. Takes less than 10 minutes, and the line is usually the longest part.
Thank you to the Pat Brown Institute and students at Cal State LA for that. I'm now pleased to introduce our guests for this evening. Hello. Annie Wu Henry is a progressive social media and digital strategy expert with a passion for on-the-ground organizing, electoral work, and online media. She has worked in digital strategy and creative direction for AOC, Way to Win, Ro Khanna, AAPI Victory Fund, the Working Families Party, and more. Annie's visionary approach has propelled campaigns and initiatives to new heights. She's well recognized for her work in social media for Senator John Fetterman's successful seat-flipping Senate campaign in Pennsylvania. And her expertise has been recognized and applauded by the New York Times, Vogue, and more. She's contributed to a myriad of prominent online platforms, creating partnerships and collaborations with brands and advocacy organizations. Thank you, Annie. Ava Mateo is the president of 18 by Vote. She has been recognized as a leader on innovative methods of youth civic engagement by the Aspen Institute, the Biden administration, Circle at Tufts, and more. In her leadership at 18 by Vote, Ava leads an entirely youth-led team in the development and execution of hyper-localized youth voter outreach programming. 18 by Vote's programming supports paid youth participants in becoming catalysts for civic action within their own communities. After studying at Sarah Lawrence College for her undergraduate degree, Ava received a master's degree in sociology and education with a concentration in education policy from Columbia University. Her research was focused on the influence of youth-led organizations and youth educational programs on youth participants' socio-political identity development. Ava, thank you for being with us. And Joe Mitchell is the founder of Run Gen Z, a national 501c4 nonprofit organization dedicated to empowering, recruiting, and mentoring the next generation of young conservative leaders as they step up to the plate and run for public office. The organization is centered around a one-of-a-kind peer-to-peer mentorship program for young conservatives to be paired up with sitting Gen Z elected officials to serve as a guiding hand and support system as they set out to serve their communities. In just over 2 years, Run Gen Z has built a coalition of over 100 young conservative elected officials and has provided mentorship to over 80 first-time candidates. Representative Mitchell was elected to the Iowa House of Representatives at the age of 21 and served in the legislature from 2019 to 2023. Outside of the legislature and his leading role in Run Gen Z, Mitchell works as a real estate developer in his home state of Iowa. Thank you all for joining us. I'd like to remind the audience at home that we'll be taking questions at the end of the conversation, so if you're watching online, you can submit those questions in the live chat on YouTube. So let's get started. My first question has to do with just kind of clearing the air a little bit about what we mean when we're talking about young people, specifically misconceptions in young voters, what the youth vote looks like. And I'd like to ask each of you, what frustration, comes to mind when people are talking about young voters. What are we getting wrong? Maybe I'll start with Joe.
Yeah. Well, Christian, thanks for the introduction. That bio probably could have been half as much of the words as that you said, but appreciate Public Square hosting this panel and this discussion here as well. And so, I was thinking about this the last few days, and I think one of the biggest misconceptions that I run to personally when I'm talking to young people, just out and about, and I love, asking my Uber drivers, people at bars and restaurants, kind of their opinion about politics and about the election. And, a lot of times I think, wow, like 90% of the people agree with what I agree with. Mm-hmm. And then you got to start thinking, okay, is this person registered to vote, right? And I think when you look at young people, obviously Gen Z votes per capita much less than a lot of other generations, baby boomers, Generation X, millennials. And so, I think you had to look at data and see what's actually happening. And you had to look at the people that are registered to vote and actually what they're thinking versus the general population, because there's 100+ million Americans that don't vote, which I think is an issue, and I think we want to obviously increase participation in the voting system. But a lot of times I think we do talk to people that were maybe have never voted before and don't plan to vote, and even if you haven't voted before, you still normally have an opinion on something, right? And so when I would say, if you want to voice that opinion, obviously you want to vote with that. But I think it's interesting, a lot of times when we have everyday conversations, we got to kind of think about, is that person registered? Are they going to vote that I just talked to? Because typically they're not high propensity voters that we're, having a discussion with randomly on the street.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Not everyone is online as we are.
Right? Yeah, right. Yeah.
Ava.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so funny. I'm going to take a different approach to this answer, but what you were saying was really making me think. And I think, I think the biggest, misconception when it comes to young people voting is really actually that young people don't want to vote. And I think that when it comes to participating in our democracy and when it comes to making your voice heard, that there's really two primary reasons why young people don't vote. And I think it's disenfranchisement and disenchantment. And I think that those are two of the really big things that are influencing why young people aren't showing up to the polls at the same level. And I think that it's not as simplistic as we really kind of make it seem. And so I think in terms of disenfranchisement, it's really difficult to vote, particularly as a young person. You're in an incredible point of transition during your first election, whether you're 18, 19, even 21, no matter in those kind of primary ages, when you're about to cast your ballot for the first time, you're going through a lot of transition. And so that just logistically makes it hard to vote. And so I think that that's something that we don't always factor in, when we're talking about young people's voter turnout. But then there's also voter ID laws. There's it's just not easy to vote, and so I think that's a huge thing. And we do currently have a system that is designed to make it so it is not easy to vote in many places across the country. And so I think fundamentally, if we're not providing access to voting, then we can't really blame young people for not making their voices heard in that way. And then I'll just say, in terms of the disenchantment, I think young people don't feel seen by politicians and by our democracy. And And that's partially because, you know, our representatives are not representative of Gen Z and of younger populations in terms of who's actually in office. But what I'll also say is, you know, politicians don't reach out to young people because they're not high propensity voters. And so they don't show up on the list to canvass, to text in the same level. And, you know, politicians specifically target those who they think are more likely to vote. And so that's why it's so important to do specific outreach and to actually give young people the tools, the resources that they need to vote. And I think that we just kind of, we make it a little too simple.
The deck is stacked against them.
Exactly.
To begin with. Annie.
Yeah, so many thoughts. I think going off of some of the things you guys said, there is disenchantment, but I do think it's not because young people don't care. And it's understanding that those two things can happen at the same time. They can maybe feel really frustrated or disillusioned by our political systems and political engagement, but also care a lot about the future of the world that they're going to live in and certain policies. And I think we see that when we look at young people, they're less likely to have some loyalty to a political party. They just want people who are going to make their lives better. They are less likely to probably support a pro-choice candidate, but they're much more likely to go volunteer at a clinic, or they're much more likely to donate to an abortion fund. Because I think that they see the tangible impact versus perhaps casting a ballot or going through these systems, electing politicians who are generations older than them to maybe or maybe not listen to them. And so I think the way they have engaged and what's been accessible for them to engage with is different. I also think that, you know, young people are kind of simplified into they care about climate change, they care about guns, which is absolutely true. Those two things I think are top of mind just for a generation that has grown up with more active school shooter drills, with a generation that is much more aware of what climate impacts they are going to be personally facing in their futures. But that's not all they care about. Young people care about the economy. Young people care about affordable housing. Young people care about being able to have a good paying job and all of these other things that I think that they think, oh, we're just gonna give them these issues, or we're just gonna reach out about these things. We're just gonna make a TikTok and use some trends. As someone who has used the TikTok and some trends, like that's not all they care about. They want politicians to hear them, to invite them in and not just like hear them out, but actually to listen. And I think that they are much less simplistic and they want to be given the same respect as any other voting bloc, and they are in many ways not.
Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like sometimes it's easy to, I don't know, make a caricature out of what a young voter is actually interested in. I'm curious about what you're hearing on the ground, you know, in the work that each of you do, in terms of, yes, issues. I'm so glad that you brought up that, you know, economy, affordability come front of mind for young people, just like any other voting group. But also in terms of this sentiment of disillusionment, how has this year felt different maybe from previous years of organizing, either for recruiting people to run for office, or for voting in a midterm year, or even checking their registration status? And, you know, I'm curious about that level of, maybe the question is about enthusiasm or interest in political news at all. Who wants to start?
I mean, one thing I think that is interesting this cycle, as someone who like candidly works in like democratic politics specifically, like I think that for so many terms people have felt like they're voting against things, and they feel perhaps that this election cycle they can be voting for something or potential or opportunity or change. I think Gen Z missed the mark. I always talk about, you know, I can tell when I'm talking, I'm a zillennial, I'm on the cusp. But my first presidential election was 2016. I think that's important because I think the difference between millennials and Gen Z is like millennials, especially on the left, like they got to vote for Obama, and Gen Z did not. And so maybe how they view the political system working or working for them is different. But I think that it's the first presidential election cycle that we haven't had, I think, what is it? A Clinton, a Bush, or what's the third one? A Biden, yeah. Or a Biden on some part of the ticket. And it just shows that like we've had a lot of the same people around for a really long time. And I think that everyone on both sides of the aisle is tired of that. And so I think people are just ready for kind of a new era of politics in a lot of ways this cycle, from at least what I'm hearing.
Be interested to hear what you think next, if you're willing.
I think this cycle is obviously different than 2020 for a lot of reasons, but COVID not happening right now. Obviously 2020 was like a lot online, a lot of absentee voting. There wasn't, even, from an advocacy grassroots perspective, you weren't going out knocking doors, right, in 2020, depending on what campaign you were on. So, this is a lot more, I would say, of a normal cycle from the advocacy and organization standpoint, similar to what a 2016 would be. But then you also do have a lot more digital and social media that is in play, similar to our 2020. So I think you see those two worlds combined of the traditional, the phone banking, the door knocking, and then also the digital and the social media that plays in to the 2024, campaign. And, obviously memes and viral videos are, specifically for young people, do sway the vote, whether you like that or not. I just looked at a graph earlier today about comparing, young people and how they felt about certain memes that were sent around for Kamala versus Trump, and the positive and negatives that those had for each campaign. And, that's a legit data point that campaigns are using to try to sway young voters one way or another. And not just young voters either. I mean, there's a lot of grandparents and parents that are on Facebook as well, right? And so,
And TikTok.
And TikTok, right? So, I mean, that's been interesting to watch that as well, and those dynamics, in play, for this race specifically.
I think even with that, like the media ecosystem, like 2024 versus 2020 is very, very different of how much information is out there, where we're getting information. Like TikTok is being utilized by campaigns this cycle, is being invested into by whether it's campaigns themselves or outside organizations or people organizing on there. We were just talking backstage a little bit that in 2020 there was grassroots kind of starting to happen on this platform that people discovered because they were locked in their houses. But now there's actually, people are understanding them, they're looking at data from them, they're trying to make sure they're using them in the most effective ways. That was not a thing in 2020, was not a thing in 2016 in many of these ways, and the way in which we're using them, the way in which we're consuming them is even different from then.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but it's interesting because I think like in terms of young people, like I think, obviously like, the young people who are voting, like I work with 16, 17, 18 and 19 year olds primarily, and those young people have never voted in a presidential election before. This is their first presidential election. And so they don't even have that comparison of like what it's like to engage. And I think obviously many of them of like kind of, engaged young people were doing organizing work as high schoolers and maybe had the experience of what it was like to, do, Zoom calls in 2020 and all of that. But it's really interesting. I've been thinking a lot about like how young people are feeling about this election, and it feels very diverse. It really feels like there is not like, a consistent feeling going towards this election, in that like I think there's a lot of nuance, there's a lot of feelings, and I think that young people are very, very motivated by the issues that they care about. And I think that that is huge, and that's like what I think is the consistency. But like in terms of young people's like engagement in this election, or kind of what's motivating them to vote, I would say it is, the issues. It is obviously like we've seen increases in voter registration rates since we've had more celebrities getting involved and making their voices heard politically. But I do think that there is still, I think it's really important to recognize that the story of the young people feeling heard is not over, and there's still so much work to be done, and we need to think about it beyond this election. And so I think like, we have the tendency to focus on what the campaigns are doing, or, what's happening when this is really big. And I think that what I'm hearing from young people who are on the ground, who are organizing in their communities, and really trying to make the world a better place, is that they want this to continue. They want this attention. They want to be heard. They want to, continue to be involved. and to have their politicians be listening to them and addressing the issues that they care about. And so even though this election looks so different, I think that in many ways, I feel like the sentiments that I heard in 2022, in 2023, have continued to this point now. And young people really want to be seen, they want to be heard, and they want to be recognized, and that has prevailed regardless of the trends. And while it has changed, and there obviously is so many things that are fluctuating, I continue to meet people who are still questioning and still really trying to understand how they feel about our democracy and understand how they want, like, you know, what it means for them to participate. So that's kind of what, yeah, that's where I've been thinking, you know, about in terms of where young people are at right now.
It's so interesting. We could go so many different directions right now. Like, I want to ask whether there is value in a celebrity endorsement anymore. You know, what is the nature of celebrity and young people nowadays? So maybe we start there. And then I also have questions about, like, there's been talk about 2020 or this election being a TikTok election. I'm wondering, is this the podcast election year where, you know, our candidates are going on all of these podcasts that have largely younger audiences? So maybe we start with the celebrity question. I'm going to start with you, Amy.
I'm a Swiftie, and I know that you know that. So I said this months and months ago when this ticket on the Democratic side hadn't even flipped yet, and people were, you know, talking about if Taylor Swift would endorse Joe Biden since she had in 2020. And I think that as someone who like admires what she's built, admires her as a career, and loves her music, I don't think her power is just her endorsement. I think that a lot of people that follow these celebrities, or whether it's, you know, a musician, whether it's an actor, et cetera, they show more than just what their talent is, and that's how they build these audiences, and that's how they build these communities. And so if you've been following Taylor Swift, if you've watched her Miss Americana, if you've seen her previous, she's made statements in the past, she's made it pretty clear where she stands on issues. And so an endorsement of whether it was Joe Biden again, or now Kamala Harris, which she did do, that's not surprising to anyone who has been paying literally any attention to her, or listening to some of her songs, or seeing what she says, or seeing her speak out against Marsha Blackburn, et cetera. And so I think that the people who, you know, are excited and are standing with her and really like seeing that endorsement that validates, you know, maybe where they stand as well from someone they really admire, they're going to be excited and they're going to be like, yay. The people who, you know, don't like it and probably don't like, you know, her boyfriend and his Pfizer commercials or whatever, they're going after that. Like, they're going to be like, oh, I hate that, which is not surprising. And then the people who are maybe in the middle, who might not agree with her politically, but are still going to be a fan of her music and still go to her concerts or whatever it might be, and say, like, I wish she would just stick to singing. I wish, like, they're probably going to be the same at the same spot. So I don't know if it moves that, but what I do think she and other people of influence have the power to do is get people engaged and mobilized. And that's what I think is the step further of getting people registered to vote, saying, here are resources, here are things, pointing to people to do their own research, which I think she did a really good job in a not alienating way in her endorsement that said, this is my endorsement, which in name only is a thing, and we'd be happy or sad or whatever it is about it. But then when she went further and said, you know, this is why I chose both Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. And like, I got there by doing my research. And I encourage you to do those things as well. And maybe you'll land on my side, maybe you won't, but this is how you get engaged in a political process, and this is why it's important. And then she shared a link that was a nonpartisan link about getting registered to vote and things like that, that gave information and resources. And that's where we see actual, you know, mobilization happening and actual action. If she would have made the post, I'm sure there are some people somewhere that will like go out just because someone they really respect. But I also argue that those people who are following so closely already like had figured that out. And so I think like in my personal capacity as Cycle, I'm working with the Swifties for Kamala, which is just a grassroots organizing group. And that happened before the endorsement. And I think again, like what's really beautiful about what they're doing with their, you know, coalition of volunteers is they're getting this excitement and they're turning it into action. And that's where I think the power of these online communities, these online stan communities or follower bases, that's where the power actually is to get people to mobilize and activate around things, to build community that's like longer term outside of hopefully just a politician or specific election. But really at the root, it's organizing.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was gonna say. I think, the power is the mobilization. It's the platform, the fact that, you have, with Taylor Swift, for example, she has the power to mobilize so many people. And so that, and what I have to say is those people are the important part. Those people are the ones who are actually going to have an impact on whether people vote, because, it's our peers who actually are the most likely person to help us make a decision to vote or make a plan to vote. And that's the person that's, most likely, going to have an impact on whether you actually show up to the polls or not. And so that power of mobilization can be transformational, but it's not necessarily like the endorsement, I would say, but it's more the power building and the organizing behind it.
I think there might be some like difference if it's someone who's never been political before or like advocating around any issues. If they start to make their voice heard, like I think that might get people who really respect them to maybe think. But I think if it's someone like Taylor Swift or Beyonce with her freedoms, or people who have
Springsteen.
like people who have been pretty vocal about whether it's like specifically around a politician, but more so just issues, that's like not surprising, is not where the needle moves.
Exactly, and what they say is like micro-influencers are much more likely to actually have an impact on their followers when it comes to being politically engaged. So if someone has less followers, those followers are more likely to be engaged and listening to what they're saying, rather than kind of the bigger folks who we do know kind of more generally what they're standing for. What I will say is I think that I work for a nonpartisan organization, but I think Kamala being on Call Her Daddy, and the same thing with I think Trump's been on other podcasts that are like reaching similar audiences. I think that that kind of being a part of people who have not made strong political stances before, that is strategic, both on the parts of the individuals who are facilitating the conversations as well as the politicians.
Yeah, I typically think the vast majority of the time, individual celebrity endorsements, don't move the needle that much. It's been interesting though, because historically, the Democrat nominee is normally the one that has kind of the celebrity Hollywood endorsements for the most part. And you still see that with George Clooney and Beyonce and Taylor Swift, and they're with Kamala. But now you're seeing with Donald Trump, you have Kid Rock and Lil Wayne and Kodak Black and a variety of actors and singers and musicians that are endorsing him and coming out for that. And he's showing up to these UFC fights, and he's going to these football games, and he's getting round of applauses. And I think it's been interesting to watch that happen, because I think you see Trump's celebrity appeal almost similar to before he announced in 2015 to run for president. And that was not the same in 2016 and 2020 when he ran, and people were not comfortable with coming out to vocally voice their support for him, and now they are. And so I think that has had a big impact for his campaign specifically and with young male voters. And then he's went on again to a lot of these long-form podcasts. He's going to be on Joe Rogan on Friday. He's been on Theo Von's podcast. He's been on the Nelk Boys. So he's been Andrew Schultz. He just did, and so he's done a lot of these long-form podcasts, which I think has moved the needle. And I think the general feeling of him being able to get some of these endorsements that Mitt Romney or John McCain or George W. Bush never would have thought of getting, I think has moved the needle for him particularly.
Yeah, it's so interesting to think about how big the audiences that some of these podcasts, that some of these micro-influencers have. It reminds me of just something that's so unique to 2024 and young people, which is, this is true for the rest of the country, but especially for young people, the fact that we don't live in a monoculture, that there's no like one network or one channel that everybody's following. I'm wondering a little bit about advantages and disadvantages to that, right? We're relying, famously at the DNC, we had journalists who were there, and we also had an array of influencers and podcasters that were also there. And Donald Trump obviously sees the power of that as well. But is there a risk to having so many silos of information, of media, specifically for young people who are encountering a lot of this information for the first time, and running into potentially media literacy problems, or how to understand what's real, what isn't? And I guess you all dabble in that in a way. How do you reckon with that?
Yeah, I always think back to like Friends, which I was not old enough to appreciate when it was like in its prime and live on TV. But like those 6 celebrities at the time of Friends were like the most famous people in the entire world. Like there were helicopters above their houses, like because everyone was watching the show. Or even like I think back to like beginning seasons of American Idol, when like everyone was watching this same show on whatever nights they were pulling out their phones and voting. And I don't think we'll get back to things like that in that magnitude because everything is so fragmented, which I don't think is necessarily a negative. I do think with these platforms and potentially their algorithms, it can give a warped perception of what people at large are thinking, because they are designed to continue to feed you things you have seen and you have engaged with. And so I think there's a lot of conversation that needs to happen around responsibilities of the platforms, also understandings from consumers. Just because young people who have grown up with screens, iPad kids, etc., they're much more digitally native, but that does not mean they're naturally media literate. And those are 2 different things and skill sets. And so I think there does need to be, a way in which we are making sure people understand what they're consuming and how, especially young people whose like frontal lobes are yet not developed, and like perhaps can fall into different traps. And there is like a way to fall into a very deep conspiracy theory hole if you watch one wrong YouTube video. And so I think that there's, again, a lot of conversation that needs to happen around these spaces. But I do think that there's, positive and negative to all that. People can find the things that they really like to watch, the types of people, they can find community in that, which can be also very positive. People finding other folks who are like them or have similar beliefs to them that they maybe didn't know existed. I came from a really small, rural, conservative, white town, and I think of certain things I thought growing up and or certain things I maybe didn't see growing up, and social media and things like that not being what it is today. And that, I'm sure I could have gone online and found different communities or things like that to find friendship or whatever people use the internet for. But that can work in the reverse, right? People can find, solidarity in a lot of other ways that maybe can be also harmful. So I think there's a lot, and we're going to see it kind of play out this election cycle. I do think it's important that these candidates and these campaigns are understanding where people are getting their media, especially young people who don't get cable, and are not going to be influenced or impacted in the same way as traditional ads and media buys have done in the past, and who do rely on things like their podcasts or their influencers or whoever they are to get the content and information that they rely on weekly. So
I think that it really comes down to civic education and the immense need for civic education in the time that we live in now. More than anything, I think we need civic education. We don't, with all of the different ways that young people are consuming media and consuming ideas and consuming thoughts, we really need to be teaching critical thinking. We need to be teaching, how to think for yourself, how to understand what a policy is versus a personality. And, really thinking about who is it that you're looking to vote for? And when it comes to our democracy in particular, how are you going to make that decision, and how do you have the skills, the experience, and I think part of it is, I think it really boils down to our education system and the need to invest in civic education in our public schools, in all schools. But I will say that I do think it starts now with peer-to-peer education and, having young people educate their friends and their siblings and other people in their lives of all ages of what it means to make an informed vote and how to find nonpartisan resources that can really help you in thinking about what you care about and what are the issues that you care about and what are the people that you're you have the option to vote for, what are they actually saying about those things. And I think that I think we need it more than ever, and I think everyone should have a shared responsibility to that need. You know, we all need to collectively support each other in making informed decisions about our democracy.
Do you know how many states civics is required? It's like
very
11 or something, like I don't know.
And regardless, there isn't, you know, civic education funding fluctuates. It's not necessarily always a robust curriculum. There is a lot of amazing work being done by the Civics X Now Coalition that is doing a lot of work on supporting increased civic education nationally. And but I really do think that it boils down to right now, in this moment, to all of us as individuals.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the more speech, the better. I think it's dangerous to talk about, you know, specifically the government censoring and stifling speech that people can have. I think one of the best things that's happened in the last, you know, probably at least decade, maybe generation, is Elon Musk buying Twitter. And I say that, you know, not as somebody that's an Elon Musk fan, and I know not everyone here is probably an Elon Musk fan or a Trump fan, but ultimately, I just saw Elon today. He tweeted something and it got community noted. So he tweeted something and it got corrected on community notes. He did not take it down. He did not tell his employees at X to take down the community note. I can never see Jack Dorsey or Mark Zuckerberg or anybody else, you know, being able to have the humility to do that. I think that's important. I think you know, what he's put in from a regulatory perspective internally at Twitter or X has been a good thing. And, you know, again, there's a lot of information that I consume on that platform that, you know, maybe I would agree with, and I see it's community noted, and go and look at the data and why that's been corrected. And so I do think it's actually been a great thing from a, you know, civic discussion perspective, and to be able to have, you know, conversations that are diverse, that are truly diverse from a diversity of thought perspective. And so, you know, again, my general thought is that the more people can speak, the better. You know, President Obama is famously quoted by saying the way that we can end hate speech is by speaking more and speaking louder than them. And, you know, I typically agree with that, you know, statement as well. And so, you know, I think ultimately, you know, the more discussions that we can have like this and that we can have that are bipartisan, whether that's on a social media platform or in person, is good for society and good for the country.
Gosh, there's so many more questions I have. I mean, one quick one is, we're also seeing a gender gap in politics, like young people, young men, young women diverging a bit. Like, quickly, I wonder if does part of that come from the fact that, you know, we have Vice President Harris going on Call Her Daddy, and we have Donald Trump going on Theo Vaughn's podcast, and people are listening to different people existing in completely different worlds, or and yeah, how do we explain that gap?
I think, I mean, part of the reason why I think the Harris campaign is going on Call Her Daddy, and, you know, Trump's going on Nelk Boys and Theo Vaughn and Andrew Schultz, is they're trying to get the low-hanging fruit, right? You're trying to get mobilized, right? You're trying to mobilize your voters. You know, ultimately at this point, you know, it's so close to the election that you're not really trying to convince people to come to your side. You're trying to get people to show up to vote and register to vote, and again, show support for you as a candidate. So ultimately, I think that's where the decision making from the specific platforms come to, and what the messaging you see right now is ultimately people are trying to get their demographics to show up to the polls and go out and vote early, you know, or vote on election day.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, it's both of the candidates that is where they have strong support, or think that they can turn people out who will likely support them. I think, like, as, again, like someone who works in Democratic politics, there definitely should be a conversation of why young men don't feel like they would align. And I don't know if the other side is also having that conversation about young women, or women in general. I think I just saw a video that was shared by someone doing, like, man on the street type of interviews. It was at a Southern SEC big school, but it was that, like, a bunch of young women that were voting for Kamala Harris because of reproductive rights. And I do think that some of these issues that are coming to the forefront for different people that feel that those issues are directly going to impact their lives does definitely have an impact on where they're going to vote. And a lot of people in the comments saying, you know, these people are going to be one-issue voters about this thing. But it's also a thing that will directly impact them. And so, like, should we be like really trying to think deeply about why a bunch of young women are going to say, like, I'm voting because of this reason that largely affects young women? I think that's a little like obvious. But I do think like this gender divide is definitely apparent. Everyone knows it. And it'll be interesting to see after this election cycle, when we see the numbers come in from the different demographics, but then also after that, how the parties perhaps try to appeal to the demographics they know they're missing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it comes down to the fact that politicians have realized that the issues are the things that are motivating young people to vote. And that's kind of where this has gone in terms of the different, the different political parties are aligning themselves with different audiences according to those issues that they care about. And so overwhelmingly, I think it's honestly an important question and something we need to not stop thinking about. Because I think that, this election is I think one of these trends have always, I think, existed in some capacity. I think it's definitely risen in levels, and so I think it's really important to question that and to think about, why are we creating more divides in our society, and why are we kind of trying to like isolate people in terms of the things that are most important to themselves, whether it's the economy, whether it's bodily autonomy, like those things are actually impact all of us. And why don't we think about that instead of, thinking about the things that are going to hit people in I would say somewhat of a manipulative way, rather than necessarily genuinely showing up and saying, listening to young people, listening to the fact that, there are certain issues that all young people care about. And it's interestingly enough, I don't think we've been talking that much about the climate this election cycle. And maybe that's because a lot of young people are not that divided on that issue. So just going to bring that up.
Well, I think it's time for us to move into Q&A. I've loved asking these questions, but I want to invite folks up. Yeah.
Thank you, Christian. Testing. Well, thank you, Christian and panelists. If you have any, for our in-person audience, if you have any questions, please feel free to come over here right next to me and feel free to ask them. But first, we're going to start with the online question. First question is, if each of the panelists could change one big thing about the way voting works in their community or the US more broadly, what would it be?
I have an immediate answer. I'm sorry, this is actually something that I think is so critical. I would have same-day voter registration. I think the biggest barrier for young people voting is not being able to show up on election day and vote. And the fact that there's so many things going on in our lives and we have to put a lot of planning into voting, and it should be made as easily as possible from my perspective as someone who wants as many people to vote as possible.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. The barriers to get out to vote are immense, especially for young people. And I think one is just also, people should have the day off or be able to get out and vote. We have holidays for many other things. And I think our democracy, the future of our country, and I'm not saying this from any lens, elections are important, and we should put value on them as a society and as a country enough to make sure people can go do that and go do their civic duty, because we call it that, and we should make it accessible for people to be able to do on that day, but also to not have to say, oh, I can register that day, but I also don't have to give up some income. I don't have to make these other weighty decisions that impact certain communities more heavily than others that don't have those choices. And so I think it democratizes the ability to be involved in democracy.
So, I have a little bit different opinion on the voting, as people can probably assume. So I think it's pretty easy to vote in most states. I was a state legislator, and we make it in Iowa specifically. We have satellite voting, we have weekend voting. I've never, ever talked to a voter or a person in my life that didn't think they had the chance to vote at some point and thought it was incredibly difficult. Ultimately, I do agree though with Annie. I think that we should have a national holiday, on the first Tuesday in November, for people to be able to vote. And I think we should make it easy to vote on election day particularly, but I would also, want to cut down time on early voting and those sort of things. If I was the one drawing up the policy, but again, as somebody that served in the legislature for 4 years and ran election bills, I think it in general is particularly easy to vote, even for college students.
Is it easy to register to vote is actually the question that I would pose.
But in Iowa it is, yeah. And it's state by state, right?
New York, yeah, exactly. In New York City, it is incredibly hard to register to vote. If you do not have a driver's license, you have to register to vote through a physical form, and you need your social security number, and you need multiple documents to prove that you're a citizen or whatever it might be. And I don't have, my point is that if it's very difficult for a young person to show up, and I understand that's opening up a whole can of worms.
Yeah, I mean,
but what I will say is that I think it should be easier to register to vote, and I don't know what that means in terms of policy. But the reality is that there shouldn't be young people who do not have access to the information that to register to vote and aren't being encouraged to do that ahead of time. So therefore, it should be made as accessible as possible.
Yeah, and I think the discussion on same-day voter registration stuff is one that people should have. Mm-hmm. Who here, just curious, in the audience, who here does not have an ID?
A driver's license.
Driver's license.
We are in LA.
but also, I mean, but a lot of states, it's not just a driver's license, it be any kind of identification card.
Yeah, I think it's a New York
I've never met a person in my life that doesn't have an identification card or a driver's license.
Yeah, I'm walking around with my passport in my pocket. So
yeah, right. So you have your passport, right? And you use your passport to register to vote.
But you can't register to vote with your passport. Anyway.
In New York, you can.
Wild
you
question.
Certainly can.
What about allowing teens to vote in local elections, like 16, 17-year-olds? That's one thing I've always wondered, potentially a way to increase some civic education and engagement.
Well, we have
we
have pre-registration in many states across the country, so you can register to vote at 16 or 17 in many states at this point, and it's increasing regularly. I think it's an interesting experiment. And I think it would be really interesting to see what the turnout would be for 18 and 19-year-olds if that was done. And I know that it is being done in certain cities across the country.
Maybe no compulsory voting. How do we feel about that?
You're just like
yeah, fine. Yeah. I love policy, so lots of questions.
Well, and a lot of it with like how civically engaged you are, what you know about it really is like how you grew up and who you grew up around. And I think that that's something when we get into certain community, like people don't understand or recognize. I always talk about my high school government teacher, which he didn't have to do. He, on our first day of class of high school senior year government, he knew we would all be turning 18 that year for the most part. And he gave us all our syllabus that we had to take home and get a parent to sign and bring back. With the requirements for the class, but then he also gave us a voter registration form, and we all had to fill it out sitting out at that desk that day. He gave us an envelope, he had us address the envelope, and he collected them, and he collected our birthdays, and on our birthdays he sent out our voter registration. And I absolutely know that there were many folks in my graduating class in our small town that would not have been registered for the first election they could have voted in if it were not for him doing that. And again, that is just like, I mean, teachers deserve the world, but like he that wasn't a requirement for him to have to do, but it was massively helpful. And even for myself as someone who was civically engaged, that like didn't have to think about when or where I would do that or figure out where I had to get the forms or how to do the things. And I think for young people, they want to be involved. They care, but so much of it is that like, you don't know what a phone bank is till someone tells you what a phone bank is. You don't know what a canvas is until someone tells you. And as people that work in it sometimes, I think we forget that entry point, especially for people who maybe have never met someone who works in politics, don't understand how campaigns work, don't understand certain things, and maybe don't have support in their life that can explain it to them. They don't know where to start. And so the accessibility, even if they want to do it, can feel really daunting.
So,
this is the last question we have time for.
Hello, excuse me. Hello, my name is Juliana. Thank you for this amazing conversation. My question is around, I guess my question is, do you think that another barrier to young voters stepping up, especially in a presidential election. We still have very important other things to vote on the ballot, such as propositions and local elections like district attorney, which is very contentious in LA right now. So I'm curious, do you all think that is also a barrier? Because I did use the LAist voter guide, and it's a lot of work to research all of that, and to feel comfortable. I admit, as a young voter, voting randomly on certain things just because I hadn't done my research. So I think my question is, do you think that that's a barrier? And I'm curious, is there any work being done in social media to bring a little bit more awareness and action? And what have you heard amongst young voters around voting on propositions and things of that nature? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I think voting, and I run a youth voting organization, 18 by Vote, and our whole model is about hyper-local education because it is so hard to learn what's on your ballot. Like, it is how not all politicians and candidates have information online about what they stand for, what they care about, what their background is. But if you're gathering young people together about issues that they care about, or just purely thinking about what's on your ballot, those, you can figure it out together, which is really powerful, is something I would say. And I think that in general, any effort that is being done to make it so it is easier to understand what local politicians and what local ballot measures and propositions. We have an exciting proposition on the ballot in New York this year, Prop 1. Yeah. And so I think that sort of education just needs to increase. I think if you can do that within your own community, I challenge you to do that. And then within broadly, we need to just be allocating more resources to that kind of voter education that can really transform how young people show up at the ballots, but I think how people of all ages show up. That's what I would say.
Yeah, I agree. I think it is really difficult to find all of the information on all of these different things. And even certain community organizations or different people, they'll do their slate of endorsed candidates, and some they don't endorse. And some they don't talk about. And I think a lot of it comes down to resources. And some of these campaigns that are so localized, they don't also have necessarily the resources to be able to get that information out at scale and to all people who might be trying to find it. And so I think ideally there's more investment into making sure this information is available and accessible to people. But that is just, trickles down, and to get the investment down locally is a battle that's, I feel like we have many things before that. not that it should, Yeah,
I feel like typically a lot of these ballot initiatives are ran very poorly and unorganized in a lot of states. So you've seen since Roe's been overturned, there's been a lot of ballot initiatives on abortion topics. And the pro-life groups have done a terrible job of getting their message out. And they've gotten their butt kicked at the ballot time and time again in every single state. And so I put that on the advocacy groups for not getting the message out on that stuff. And it's not just the life issue, it's it's marijuana issues, it's different sort of ballot initiatives that are out there. But I think a lot of times the advocacy groups, for the most part, they don't have the juice, they don't have the capital. They don't have a good messaging campaign either. So I think a lot of that also falls on those advocacy groups or a campaign to get their message out and to also inform and educate voters on the issue at hand.
So we need to invest more in community organizing is what I would say.
But I would also argue maybe the ballot initiatives have passed because of organizing on the other side that was good.
No, I'm 100%. No, I agree. I give you guys props on a lot of that stuff. I think particularly, again, I'm saying on the right side, we have not done a good job when it comes to ballot initiatives, which is a whole different beast even than just running a candidate for a campaign. And I think we are miles behind.
Florida will be interesting because of the threshold it has to hit. Yeah. It's not just a majority; it's like 60%.
Mm-hmm. And will young people turn out?
Right.
That's my question.
That's the key. Most margins aren't 60% is difficult, no matter where you are.
That's the question, Do we think we're going to get record turnout this year among young voters?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Yeah.
I like to stay optimistic.
Okay.
We did, it was an 11-point increase in 2020 in comparison to 2016. And there is more money being invested in this election than I think has ever been invested before. And so we'll see if it pays off. And I think if, we'll see how young people turn out. But what I would say to everyone and anyone, encourage young people in your life to make a plan to vote, encourage all people in your life to make a plan to vote, and you might have an impact on whether there's record turnout.
Well, and then it's also once people become a voter, then they oftentimes continue to do it. And so it's really is if you can get people started young and knowing also there's elections every year. And so if they can get out to vote this year, it will be a little less hard to get them out next year and the year after that.
Yeah, we need to invest in them early.
We do. Well, what a great conversation that we've had. I think it's time for us to close. Annie, Ava, Joe, thank you for a fantastic conversation. Please give our guests another round of applause. And thank you to Zócalo Public Square for presenting this program. You'll be able to find a summary of the program on Zócalo's website in coming days, as well as interviews with all the panelists, including me. And please subscribe to Zócalo's newsletter, podcast, and social media for more of these great conversations. We invite our in-person audience to continue the conversation at our reception with light bites and beverages. And I'll now turn it over to Moira Shuri, Executive Director of Zócalo Public Square.
Get a little cozy and come all the way back here. Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Moira Shuri, the Executive Director of Zócalo Public Square, and I'm about to do something that a little unusual. I'm going to ask you a question, but that's not the unusual part. For 21 years, Zócalo has been asking essential questions in service of our mission, connecting people to ideas and to each other. You already know the way we celebrate curiosity and create civil engagement and civil dialogue to promote a sense of community and belonging. You've been a part of it. But tonight, I'm going to ask you a question we've never asked you before. Will you support us by making a tax-deductible gift? Tonight, we invite you to join our donor community, The Square, as a founding member. Everything we do is free. With your help, we will continue to keep our programming free for everyone. There are even a few perks, like early registration for Zócalo events, invitations to members-only gatherings, and behind-the-scenes access. We've bought you a glass of wine for the last 21 years, and now we're asking you for one in return. Just scan one of the QR codes you see around or talk to any of my colleagues over at the Zócalo team. If you're joining us online, you can go to our homepage or visit the link in our YouTube chat. I hope I can count on you to keep the conversation going. But now, as always, go mingle, eat, drink, and be merry. See you next time.